For me, what I try to do is everything is based on facts. Everything is based on letters, diary entries, reports from contemporaries, their own books they write. But then I try to put it together in a more novelistic way, but that never inventing anything. So that's why it takes me a long time to write my books, because I need to find descriptions of a particular part of the landscape they walk through, or when they, say they live in Paris, then I've tried to find lots and lots of contemporary descriptions of Paris at that time, so I can recreate the kind of the noise and the smell, the what people wear. That's very, very important for me, because in an ideal world, I would like my readers to read this, and it feels as joyous to read as a novel. But at the same time, you learn a lot about this historical figure, whoever that might be.
Welcome to the Shaping Science podcast, where we talk with experts from science, academia, industry, and beyond to explore the latest in research, education, and innovation for the public good. I'm Nick Dirks. I'm the president of the New York Academy of Sciences, and our guest today is Andrea Wulf, an internationally best-selling historian and author whose work has reshaped how we understand the relationship between science, nature, and culture. Across her work, Wulf brings to life the intellectual networks and ideas and people that have shaped modern understandings of the natural world, from Enlightenment science to Romantic philosophy. Her latest book, which was just very recently released, is The Traveler, a sweeping biography of George Forster, or Georg Forster, the visionary 18th century naturalist and explorer. It chronicles his journey from a child prodigy sailing with Captain Cook to a radical voice advocating for universal human rights. We are delighted to welcome you, Andrea, to our Shaping Science podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to begin not with The Traveler, your newest book, but with your book 2 books ago, The Invention of Nature, which was the first work of yours I read about Alexander von Humboldt. Humboldt follows Forster and clearly read his great account of his voyage, but is a much better known figure. But somebody you decided to use as a kind of way into thinking about not only the discovery of the world in the late 18th and early 19th century, but also a time when science was very different, when science was not something you could distinguish from history or philosophy or even early anthropology. And in a way, all of the people you've been chronicling in your last 3 books transgress what we would today consider to be the kind of disciplinary containers and boundaries that we think about when at some place like the Academy of Sciences, we try to describe what science is. And in a way, with the concept of the Anthropocene, we're coming back to a much earlier kind of conception of natural history. So I think these books have a kind of contemporary salience that is something that you use, but of course you use in books that are so compelling, so readable, to make into both great stories, but also, I think, lessons for us today about how we should think about the world. So I'd like to go back to the Invention of Nature book. How did you decide to do that and focus on Alexander? And what kinds of surprises did you encounter along the way in doing the research for and then writing the book?
The interesting thing about The Invention of Nature is that for me, it was never a biography about Humboldt. It was always a biography of an idea.
Uh-huh.
So that nature is this interconnected whole, this living organism, this web of life. And it became a Humboldt biography, although I would still say it's not a real biography, because I have 8 mini biographies in there of the people who he then influenced with his new concept of nature. But I think for me, as a historian, I don't think that history is just this kind of pile of dusty old ideas. I think that the past shapes the present, and I can, as a historian, I can't predict the future, but I can try to, polish the lens of the past a little bit to make some more sense of what's happening today. So I've always been interested in themes that interest me today, that somehow have a effect on our life. So with Humboldt, it was really, with the invention of nature, it was really the question, why have we destroyed so much of our magnificent planet? And when did we start to understand, and maybe also why have we not listened to those early voices? So for me, Humboldt, when I started, was this figure who is this forgotten father of environmentalism. I mean, Humboldt warned about harmful human-induced climate change already in 1800. Extraordinary foresight. And the great surprise for me was, because I did not think that when I started, was that he's really he's the bridge between the Enlightenment and Romanticism. And he is, coming back to your question about, what were the sciences then, what are they today? This is a moment when the sciences are still not in this kind of narrow box of how we understand the sciences today. And Humboldt really unites the arts and the sciences, and the subjective and the objective. So he is someone who's very, on the one hand, he carries 42 scientific instruments up and down the Andes. He spends 5 years in South America, obsessively measuring quite a lot of things. But at the same time, he was someone who always insisted that there's also a sense of wonder and awe to nature. So he said, to truly understand nature, we can't just rely on empirical data. We also have to understand our feelings. And that was something that I did find surprising. I've become a complete convert since doing this book, because I think that is something that is missing in our current debates about climate change, the climate crisis at the moment. We talk, I think, too much just scientifically about it. We sometimes forget that we are only going to protect what we love. So I think we need filmmakers and writers and poets, photographers who can help us change our behavior. So that was the surprising bit for me. But the beginning was really to look at humans' relationship to humankind, to look at human relationship to nature.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting way of putting it that Humboldt was a bridge between the Enlightenment and Romanticism, but the way you now describe it as effectively, trying to use in a way Humboldt to bring together both this obsession that develops from the 18th century on with measurement, which continues, into the 19th century. Francis Galton goes around the world trying to measure everything in Victorian times, but without that kind of poetic sensibility. And Alexander von Humboldt is not just a scientist, but and a naturalist in a kind of broad sense. He's an ethnographer. He's a historian. He's making discoveries that would not know where they would fit in a curriculum in a university and so on. But I was also recently having a conversation with a group of people who were concerned about the current onslaught of climate science. And they were arguing that the concept that we need to use rather than climate is nature. And I wanted to ask you your thoughts about that, because, of course, nature doesn't seem to have an immediate political meaning or bias or affiliation with a political party or position. But nature is, of course, this kind of totality that is very much tied up with and part of this current struggle that we are seeing us beginning to wage against the effects of our human habitation on the planet and what we're doing to it in relationship to what we otherwise call climate change.
Well, climate is part of nature, isn't it? And when you look at the kind of big conferences, the big COPs about biodiversity are, it is kind of insane that that's separate from the climate one, because it all belongs together. And I think that's part of what, made us or put us into this situation, this idea that we can classify or categorize everything kind of down to kind of the most narrow discipline. And I think the one thing that I feel we could really learn from these earlier scientists is that you bring together rather than take apart. So it's not the kind of Linnaean idea of classification, of taxonomy, but it's the more Humboldtian idea of the web. Everything hangs together. This is a kind of very complex tapestry, and if you pull one thread, the whole thing will unravel. And so climate belongs to nature. And you're right, nature is maybe not as fraught, kind of in its connotation. Everybody loves nature, I think. But we still don't do enough about it. And I think that's why I feel that we do need not just scientists. That's not to say that, I love the sciences. It's not to say that they don't have a place. I think it's about working together on a much more holistic approach.
Well, I'd like to maybe come back to that set of questions a little bit later in our conversation, but just in terms of the book itself, Alexander von Humboldt, he lived until he was, 90
just
years
before
old?
He dies, just before his 90th birthday.
Just before he dies, he hands in to the publisher his 5th volume of Cosmos, which is this immense work. You must have had a lot of reading.
I did. That took me a few years, that book. He also wrote around 50,000 letters and received about 100,000. I did not read all of them, but a lot of them. But, for me, the research is the fun bit. Because if you go back to the primary sources rather than secondary sources, you really get to know the person you write about. Because even if they don't write about their feelings, which many of them don't, but you understand their daily life, you understand their obsessions, their friendships, their gossip behind, other people's back. Humboldt was certainly also a flawed personality. He was a bit of a show-off, so we have wonderful descriptions of him at parties where people say, I'm not going to leave the party before Humboldt is leaving, because he really always kind of says something terrible when people leave the room.
Really?
So for me, it is part of the joy to read the primary sources, the letters and the diaries, very much part of the books I write.
But, what you managed to do so well is to bring out the person, the subject of the biography. And I gather this, too, was a kind of multiple biography, although Humboldt is the key character. But you do that to kind of keep the narrative extremely compelling at the same time that you're describing each one of his where he goes on his expeditions, the kind of scientific interests he has, the multiple ways in which he approaches the questions he's asking, exploring, and discovering, and of course, always coming back to questions of his own life, his own career, his somewhat mysterious private or hidden private life. As you do that, you're kind of straddling the biographical genre and a more historical kind of or broader stroke historical kind of text. And I gather that's a deliberate thing on your part?
Very much so. I think, for me, nonfiction doesn't need to be dull and boring just because it's based on facts. Sometimes actually facts are so much more insane than what you could make up. And sometimes, if you would make it up in a novel, your editor would probably say, it's a bit far-fetched. So for me, what I try to do is everything is based on facts. Everything is based on letters, diary entries, reports from contemporaries, their own books they write. But then I try to put it together in a more novelistic way. But that never inventing anything. So that's why it takes me a long time to write my books, because I need to find descriptions of a particular part of the landscape they walk through, or when they, say they live in Paris, then try to find lots and lots of contemporary descriptions of Paris at that time, so I can recreate the kind of the noise and the smell, the what people wear. That's very, very important for me, because in an ideal world, I would like my readers to read this, and it feels as joyous to read as a novel. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, you learn a lot about this historical figure, whoever that might be.
You went on from The Invention of Nature to write Magnificent Rebels, which is in some ways, very different kind of book. It's set at the same time, and many of the same characters surround Humboldt, who become the primary subjects of the next book. But your object of study there is the self, not the world. Could you just say a little bit about how you made that switch and how you saw the relationship between the focus on the world at large and the cosmos in Humboldtian terms, and then the self and the, Schelling and Schiller and ultimately Goethe and the characters who make up that wonderful book?
So it's a book about a rebellious group of thinkers and philosophers and writers who come together in a very small town in Germany called Jena at the end of the 18th century. And they revolutionized the way we think about the world, nature, but also ourselves. And for me, it was almost a very natural follow-up to the invention of nature, just as The Traveller is a follow-up. I just wrote them all in the wrong way around. They kind of belong all together, but I should have written them
in
the
reverse
wrong way.
order. Yeah.
In reverse, yeah. The Traveller should have been first, then Magnificent Rebels, and then The Invention of Nature. But that's not how it works. But so the Magnificent Rebels, what I wanted to do there is, as I said earlier, I'm always interested in something that has an effect on us today. And for me, the question was, why are we such a selfish species? Which, of course, has also something to do with us destroying the planet, because we see ourselves more important than nature. So in that sense, it seemed, for me, a natural follow-up. So with Humboldt, I looked at the relationship between us and nature, but I thought it's not enough. I need to also ask questions. When did we become so selfish? When did we expect that we can determine our own lives and destinies? And when did we first ask a question such as, how can we be free? So this book is really about this extraordinary moment in the late 18th century, sparked by the French Revolution, where philosophers put the self in the center of their theories, their ideas. So they don't believe anymore that there are some absolute or God-given truths. The only certainty we have is that the world is experienced through the self. So that becomes the focus in that book.
So very interesting, because you some of the same characters play a role in that book, who appear in The Invention of Nature. But on the face of it, the preoccupation with the invention of an idea of the modern self that is both detached from society, that is organized around a principle of freedom, is a very different kind of focus. But some of the same people are doing it. And of course, you have poets, and you have philosophers, you have brilliant lecturers, and you have cantankerous contestants in various kinds of everything from academic warfare to, trying to control a journal here or a lecture post there. And it feels very contemporary in the way in which it depicts a kind of larger academic politics. But it's clearly, a central place for the emergence of a lot of modern ideas about individual selfhood. But then you kind of go back in The Traveller, and I want to turn to your most recent book, of course, and you focus on somebody who doesn't have the kind of notoriety, and certainly doesn't probably find himself nearly as well known as either of the Humboldt brothers or any of the great philosophers you write about in Magnificent Rebels, leave alone, the poet laureate of Germany, Goethe. But and you go back in time to the late 18th century, but you're fascinated by this somewhat lost figure of history. So how did you happen to focus on him? What made you decide to write a book about him? And in a way, this is more biographical than any of the previous two books.
Yes, this is my most kind of proper biography. So Magnificent Rebels was really a group biography. The Humboldt book was more a biography of an idea, and this is a proper biography. So George Forster is probably the most fascinating man most people have never heard of. And I have to admit that I do love writing about a forgotten hero. I mean, Alexander von Humboldt is known within kind of certain academic circles, but when I started this book, and I would come to the US, very well-educated people had never heard of Humboldt. So it is much more fun to write about someone like Humboldt than, say, about Darwin, where there are so many books about Darwin. So every letter you read, someone else has used, or many, many people have used dozens of times. So I do like that. But Forster, so I came across Forster because he was Humboldt's mentor. He's 15 years older than Humboldt. And Humboldt, throughout his very long life, always maintained, right until he dies, that George Forster was his inspiration to go on his own 5-year exploration of South America, but also he said that Forster guided his ideas of nature and politics. And then he was also a good friend, very close friend of Caroline Schlegel, who was a protagonist in Magnificent Rebels, who's this fiercely independent, wonderful kind of female character. So a person who was admired by Humboldt and by Caroline Schlegel was anyway kind of worth investigating. But then it was really Forster's own voice that pulled me into his story, his kind of letters and his writing, because he is this extraordinary young man who becomes a traveler at the age of 10. So he's born in 1754. He becomes a traveler at the age of 10 when he accompanies his really difficult and tempestuous father as a botanist on a wild expedition through Russia. Then, just before George's 12th birthday, his father takes him to London, where the young boy becomes the family's breadwinner by translating popular travel accounts. At 16, he attends the learned meetings of the Royal Society. At 17, he joins Captain Cook's second voyage. So quite a CV for a teenager. And he returns.
This is all before he even had the opportunity to drop out of college. Because
he never had a
these are his high school years.
He never had formal school education. He returns when he's 20, and he writes this stunning travel account, very popular, becomes famous across Europe, has these fabulous fights with intellectuals such as Immanuel Kant, gets pulled into the vortex of the French Revolution, ends up in revolutionary Paris, where he dies at the age of 39. Yeah. So that's a kind of very quick kind of summary. But it does happen in history that someone truly extraordinary disappears from our collective memory. In Forster's case, I think it was because he broke the rules, he was accused of treason, and he was actually too far ahead of his own time. He returns from the Resolution voyage, and this is really what pulled me into his story, with a remarkably unbiased attitude towards indigenous people. Mm-hmm. He returns with a deep-seated belief in the equality of races, which is so unusual at that time. So he returns in 1775. So he's one of the very first people to use the term and concept human rights at a time when American revolutionaries and then later French revolutionaries firmly exclude women, non-Europeans, and slaves. George Forster writes in 1777 of the general rights of mankind, and he includes all of these groups. For him, everybody, no matter from where you are, what your beliefs are, you have the equal rights for freedom, but also for dignity. And if you look at our current climate, that was just something where I thought I want to understand why someone who was brought up in a deeply racist society, how could he have been so open-minded? And maybe is there something that we can learn today? It's just a story that I felt needed to be told.
Well, one fears almost that it was his very lack of education that allowed him to come to various kinds of opinions and worldviews on his own. But that, of course, doesn't fully explain anything, because we know this kind of fundamental, prejudice is it's in the water, it's in the air, it's everywhere in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and God knows it's still with us in the 21st century. But absolutely, in terms of contemporary, even leading whatever you would call them, liberals or progressive thinkers. Slavery was largely accepted, certainly in the U.S., and many of the accounts that are being compiled in the 18th century and early 19th century travels of European explorers are redolent with statements that you really don't want to quote, because they do reflect complete hierarchalization of cultures and peoples and civilizational attributes and the like. But let's back up and talk a little bit more in detail about George's life. So, he's a breadwinner at age, 15, 16, you said.
Yes.
He clearly is precocious, to say the least. And he has the opportunity, effectively, because his father substitutes at the last minute for Joseph Banks on the second of Captain Cook's grand expeditions, to go around the world and go back to Australia, New Zealand.
They didn't go to Australia, but
they went to New Zealand.
New Zealand several times.
But to also try to discover the continent of Antarctica. But as you said just now, and as the book shows in great detail, it's a 3-year voyage. Captain Cook's second. And a time over the course of 3 years when the Resolution encountered a great many different peoples and cultures, predominantly in the South Pacific. But give us a sense of how you see George sort of developing a theory of the world, if you would have it, during that period of time. Because the book, of course, is written upon his return. But he has letters and he has diaries. Some of them, of course, get swept overboard, and others get drenched in water that comes in from storm and the like. But you have a sense of him over the course of this period of time developing a way of looking at the world.
There's a very interesting moment. So they basically tried to find the kind of fabled southern continent. So they spent a lot of time down in the kind of icy polar seas of Antarctica, which on a sailing boat in the 18th century must have been pretty horrendous, dressed in kind of woolen clothes that never dries. So they go 3 times down to Antarctica, and then they kind of go up to New Zealand and then to the kind of more tropical islands, Tahiti, Tonga, Easter Island, the Vanuatu archipelago. So the first time they arrive in New Zealand, they encounter the Maoris. They arrive, the ship is pretty battered from 4 months in Antarctica. So Cook sets up all these workshops at shore, sailmakers who repair the sails and carpenters. And there's this, constant noise of hammers and saws and kind of activity. And George Forster writes, "Look at us. We bring industry to these barbarians." So he's very much a child of the Enlightenment who looks down on the Maori, the barbarians, the savages. But within 6 weeks, this has completely and utterly changed. So 6 weeks later, he writes about them in a very, very different way, because he spent 6 weeks with them. He's a very talented linguist who kind of picks up languages quite quickly. I mean, he always admits that he will never quite understand the kind of intricacy of their government, for example, but he learns, he encounters them as humans, not as barbarians or as half humans, as many of the rest of the queue. And his tone completely switches, and he begins to criticize the crew for their callousness, for their very liberal use of firearms. I mean, islanders get wounded and shot and killed. He's very open about this criticism. He criticizes British imperial or European imperial ambitions. And very quickly, he writes things like, I wish the intercourse between the South Seas and Europeans had never happened. And it's terrible for them. The Europeans just bring death and disease. So within a very, very, very short period, he thinks very differently to the rest of the crew on the ship. And as they go along, this journey, this voyage really becomes for him a voyage of human interaction. So he is a truly intuitive ethnographer. He records their languages, he observes their customs, he enjoys their food, he observes and records their appearances, their clothes, their jewelry. And to this day, his descriptions, his accounts still count as the best description of early Polynesian culture before European contact. And he doesn't judge. And that's the extraordinary thing. So where other explorers approach indigenous people with, or through the lens of arrogance at best, but brutal disgust at worst, he tries to keep an open mind. And that is what is so different about him. And I think, he's still very young. He's, between 17 and 20. I think it helped that he still has this kind of quite malleable brain. I mean, there are a lot of other young people who don't have that, so that's not exclusively the reason. But I think it's one of the points that makes him so open-minded.
So you trace this kind of change of attitude on his part that happens pretty early on. He is throughout many of his writings quite critical of his European colleagues on the ship. He doesn't approve of all the sexual interactions that take place in places like Tahiti, and he is troubled by some of the violence that is enacted. But he also develops a theory of Polynesian migration. So I wanted you to tell us a little bit about that, because it seems that he got it substantially right, which is kind of astonishing given how he could only put together fragments of any kind of story, either about language or about the movement of peoples over, hundreds of years, in what, historical ethnographers now have a much better understanding of than they certainly did at the time.
Yeah, so he is an 18-year-old who looks at or compares the different languages he encounters across the South Pacific and looks at the distribution of the breadfruit tree across the South Pacific. And through that, he develops a stunning, and as we know today, correct theory of Polynesian migration, so that he doesn't know the dates, but he has worked out basically that they must have moved from Southeast Asia across the South Pacific. And it's a theory that, it takes the world 200 years to catch up with him, really, to kind of prove this by DNA analysis and agricultural studies. But for me, this was also just another kind of jigsaw puzzle to see how open-minded he is about whatever he sees. And it really begins with seeing that the languages that they encounter are not that different. Sometimes it's just one letter that is different between, the word for canoe in Tahitian or in Maori. But the breadfruit tree, and he writes this short treatise about it. And you think like, wow, this is kind of meant to be a botanical treatise about breadfruit trees. And he turns it into this extraordinary theory of Polynesian migration, because he sees the breadfruit trees and they're all seedless. So he knows that the only way to cultivate them is by human. So he when he returns, he finds in kind of old botanical volumes, he finds descriptions of breadfruit trees with seeds, which have much smaller fruits from Indonesia. So he says, well, then the only explanation is that Polynesian ancestors must have taken them across the sea, and as they settled the South Pacific, they took the breadfruit trees with them. And it shows for him two things. One, that it's the theory of Polynesian migration, but also it shows the sophistication of the agricultural methods of the Polynesians. So just as we have changed wheat through selective breeding, they have done exactly the same thing. They've changed this smaller breadfruit tree with lots of seeds into this kind of larger, more nutritious, seedless variety. So again, it's always combined with an openness of, these can't be savages, because they have these sophisticated languages, they have sophisticated kind of concepts of deity, but also of agricultural methods.
And as you describe this, he's moving from one thing to another. He uses the breadfruit tree as a kind of vehicle for thinking about migration, to be sure, but it, as you say, also becomes a way of writing about the economy, about the political economy, about the culture, about the social organization, and in some respects also the religious and ritual life of the islanders. But as you read through his materials and so on and so forth, where else did he capture some aspects of Southern Pacific island life that continue to be seen as basically correct by contemporary ethnographers? I mean, for example, in relationship to notions of family, ideas of sexuality, notions of hierarchy.
Yeah, he's very interested in kind of governance. Cook always tries to find out who's the chief here, because that's the person Cook wants to deal with. And Forster is more interested in the society as a whole. So there is I think from his early travels in Russia, where he saw German settlers, destitute German settlers who are so poor that they live in earth dugouts in the ground. So this is the first time he really sees the harsh reality of despotism and inequality. And these themes obsess him for the rest of his life. So when they travel through the South Pacific, he's interested to work out what are the hierarchical structures here. Are there hierarchical structures? And so for him, for example, even if he can work out there is some kind of class system, for example, in Tahiti, he also observes, well, they have chiefs, but they, paddle a canoe just as, the other kind of people on the island. But he also very much rejects Rousseau's idea of the noble, peaceful savage. So he doesn't, and I think that's one of the interesting things about him, he doesn't romanticize like Rousseau, but he also doesn't demonize. So when he sees, for example, all the weapons in Tonga, he goes and says, well, this is clearly a kind of people who are at war with their neighbors. Mm-hmm. The same when he sees the kind of war, the beautiful war armada, splendid, magnificent double-hull canoes in Tahiti. For him, that is a proof that Rousseau's peaceful savage just doesn't exist. But at the same time, he also sees that certain concepts that we have just don't function in Polynesian culture. So where Cook and the rest of the Resolution crew are really annoyed and furious with the Tahitians for stealing knives and tools and bed linen and clothes, he tries to keep an open mind. And instinctively, he understands that the concept of property must be different. And he says vice and virtue are relative concepts. Different people have different cultures, different belief systems, and he refused to use European morals as a framework to judge them. the same with cannibalism. When they witness cannibalism in New Zealand, and I mean everybody's just appalled and disgusted. He refuses to judge the Maoris, and he said, "Well, we don't understand their value system. How can we judge them?" And then he says, "And in any case, Europeans see themselves as being too civilized to be cannibals, but don't we send thousands of people into war just because a ruler, a monarch, kind of decides to, have a war with another country and they all die? Isn't that kind of as brutal as eating?"
No, he takes Montaigne's essay on cannibalism, and then he notches it up to a much higher level of critique of Western sensibilities and ethnocentrism. But these examples are powerful in part because the conventional story and the history of cultural anthropology is that it's not until the 20th century that ideas of cultural relativism really become accepted at all. Predominantly in the story of another German who spent some time traveling more north than south, Franz Boas, who did his PhD in physics in Germany and then moved to the U.S. and ultimately became the chair and founding figure in the anthropology world at Columbia University. And then in the hands of his students, and Margaret Mead, Ruth Benedict, Melville Herskovits, and others, notions of cultural relativism kind of take hold, and they become the kind of grammar that cultural anthropology uses in its post-war development. But here Forster is sort of doing this way ahead of his time, and so much ahead of his time that he's of course able to contest Rousseau, as you say, but his ideas don't seem to be picked up by others. And I was curious if you have traces in the 19th century of people who went back and were deeply influenced beyond Humboldt, who obviously saw this as a kind of validation of his interest in traveling the world and exploring and so on and so forth. But do you see traces of influence, or is he kind of forgotten in every way because of his peculiar life story in part?
Well, I think Humboldt really overtakes and overshadows him eventually. Humboldt becomes such a huge figure that Forster is really forgotten. But I think he's forgotten beforehand because he's the co-founder of Germany's first republic, and he's then declared a traitor, and he ends up in revolutionary Paris where he dies. So he's very purposefully written out of German history. Mm-hmm. He is, a German who criticized British imperialism was never going to be popular in Britain. So it is only in the mid-20th century, so 200 years after his birth, that historians in East Germany rediscover him for his role in the Mainz Republic, which is this first German republic, because they are really looking for a hero revolutionary. I think another reason why he's forgotten today is he died very, very young. He died when he was 39. If you think about Humboldt, who died just before his 90th birthday, most of Humboldt's important works were written after he was 39. And Humboldt says it a couple of times. He said, had Forster lived longer, he would have, achieved great, great things. In the end of the day, his most famous work is his A Voyage Around the World. And then after that, he writes a lot of essays and kind of shorter treatises. So he didn't have the lifespan to expand on all these ideas. Also because he was such a polymath, a bit like Humboldt, who just, fiddles around in all these different disciplines. So there's not just one thing he was famous for. He did so many different things. But I do believe, had he lived longer, we would have known more about him
but
today.
as you say, he also had a very tumultuous life. I mean, he kept moving from place to place. He got offers that he couldn't refuse, but that meant moving household. He got married. His marriage was not an especially happy one, as tolerant as he was of his wife's ambivalence, and then ultimately taking up with another friend. His movement around Europe, his going to Paris. I mean, it's kind of hard to, get a lot done under circumstances that you describe in his post-resolution 19 years.
His is also a very tragic life. I mean, it starts with this very difficult and volatile father who controls George's life really for the first 22 years. I mean, George Forster does not have a choice to go on the resolution. His father decides that he's going to go. At the same time, of course, because of his father's great love for knowledge and adventure, George Forster receives a quite extraordinary education, not a formal education.
Yeah, he's kind of homeschooled by a tyrant.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So his father is very, very difficult, and George, I mean, literally escapes the dark shadow of his father when he's in his early 20s. But then part of this pattern is repeated in his marriage to Therese Heine, who is this wild, free-spirited, educated daughter of a celebrated scholar in Germany who has a great love for books, but also for men. And they have a very unhappy marriage with an entanglement of feelings. And there are a couple of situations where there are really three people in the marriage. And also George Forster has one thing he really inherited from his father is he likes to spend money. He cannot control his expenses. So he ends up pretty quickly with a huge debt. And he then takes a job as a professor for natural history in Vilnius, which is then part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and really very, very, very removed from the European intellectual centers. And he's deeply unhappy there. And his mood only lifts when he has this very public fight with Immanuel Kant about the human races, where Kant says there are 4 different human races, all defined by the color of their skin, with white Europeans, of course, the pinnacle of creation. And George Forster says, well, hold on a second. During my travels, I've seen a great many people who do not fit into these neat categories. So he writes a kind of public, refutes Kant publicly, but all of that can just not relive the excitement he had on the resolution voyage. And I think this happens to a lot of explorers. I mean, Humboldt had the same thing, that all his life Humboldt wanted to go on another exploration. You've seen these great things, and then you suddenly have this quite boring job at a desk. It's very, very hard. And Forster also wanted to go on other expeditions. There was one expedition organized by the Russians, which almost happened, but then the Russians and the Turkish Empire, they have a kind of war, so it doesn't happen. So but I also think, had he lived longer, he probably would have gotten, would have been invited to yet another exploration, because people back then, and it's difficult for us to imagine, the whole of Europe and Russia knew him. He was famous, and everybody wanted to meet him. I mean, he meets everybody from George III to Benjamin Franklin, Goethe, Mary Wollstonecraft, who's just written her kind of explosive book about female suffrage, Thomas Paine. I mean, he meets them all, and they all want to meet him because he's so well known.
And that, of course, does make it even more puzzling in a way why he disappears without a great deal of trace. To have a big public fight with Immanuel Kant, it's pretty big stuff. I mean, that would make many the career of an academic in the equivalent kind of context today.
But he then became a traitor. And that was the big problem. I mean, all his friends and family turn away from him because it was one thing to support the French Revolution, which a lot of kind of liberal Germans did, but to initiate a German revolution, that was not acceptable.
So he initiated a German revolution. He went to Paris. He continued to defend the French Revolution long after it turned violent and the terror began. And then he had no one really to preserve his memory or write his history until you came along.
Well, there have been a few Germans who've written about him, but I felt that he really needed, and I think this is why it's a biography in the more kind of tradition away. He really needed someone to tell his story, because he's for a long time the way East German historians talked about him was just him as a revolutionary. And he's often been described as this, man with the potential, but then completely under the thumb of his father. And I felt that we need to read his letters and find out who he really was. And the amazing thing is that he left a lot of letters, but the really extraordinary thing is that I don't think ever in my 2 decades of reading letters from the 18th century, seen so many letters where someone is so honest with himself and the world around him. There's an immediacy and directness and raw emotions on the paper that is very, very, very unusual. So you can actually, I was able to be in his head much more than with Humboldt, because Humboldt's letters were much more scientific. He was, he wrote so many letters with other scientists kind of exchanging ideas. But Forster was very open about his emotion. He wrote to his friends. So there are letters which very much reveal his very complicated relationship with his father. They're deeply sad letters that he writes to his wife, Therese, talking about his love, while we know with the knowledge of hindsight that at the same time she has an affair with his friend.
Right.
So there's a openness that is just utterly wonderful, where you feel I can try to recreate or recapture a life here that is really forgotten.
Yeah. Well, we've only actually scratched on the surface of this wonderful book, but I hope that the listeners of this podcast will go off and have a chance to read it for themselves. But Andrea, thank you so much for joining us on Shaping Science. This has been a wonderful conversation, and it is a magnificent book. Thank you.
Thank you.
To learn more about the New York Academy of Sciences, including information on upcoming events, visit us online at nyas.org and follow us at NIAS Sciences. Shaping Science is made possible with the generous support of Tata Sons.